Welcome to the Transforming Trauma podcast. Transforming Trauma is presented by the NARM Training Institute. I'm your host, Emily Ruth, and I'm so glad you've joined us today. Hi, Transforming Trauma listeners. We're thrilled to share with you that the new NARM book is coming out on July 26th. The Practical Guide for Healing Developmental Trauma Using the Neuroaffective Relational Model to Address Adverse Childhood Experiences and Resolve Complex Trauma is written by our very own NARM creator, Dr. Lawrence Heller, and NARM senior trainer, Brad Kammer. This book is designed to promote personal and collective change. The intention is to make NARM accessible for anyone working with or dealing with complex trauma. Using therapeutic examples and helpful exercises, Brad and Larry demonstrate how NARM can serve as a catalyst to promote healing and post-traumatic growth. Whether you are a mental health or other helping professional, or simply interested in personal growth, we hope you will find this book useful in your professional work and personal healing. The Practical Guide for Healing Developmental Trauma is available for pre-order now on Amazon and other online book retailers. Please visit narmtraining.com/books to stay up to date on the latest news, promotions, and giveaways. Dr. Sandra L. Bloom is a board-certified psychiatrist, graduate of Temple University School of Medicine, and currently Associate Professor of Health Management and Policy at Drexel University. She is also the founder of Creating Presence, an online organizational approach for creating trauma-informed systems. In extending her work to include this online delivery program, Dr. Bloom hopes to make the innovative approach to service delivery, known as trauma-informed, more available and cost-effective. Dr. Bloom is also past president of the International Society for Traumatic Stress Studies and author or co-author of a series of books on trauma-informed care called Creating Sanctuary: Toward the Evolution of Sane Societies. She is currently co-chairing a new national organization, CTIPP, the Campaign for Trauma-Informed Policy and Practice. She has also served as co-chair for the Philadelphia ACEs Task Force. Please enjoy this conversation with Dr. Sandra Bloom. Hey, we are here with Dr. Sandra Bloom. Sandy, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Emily. It's good to be here.
It's so good to have you. I'm really excited to talk to you and hear more about the work that you're doing and all the goodness that you bring into the world. I know that you've been in the field for a long time, so you'll have a lot of things to share with us, I think.
Yeah, I'm old.
You're matured in the field.
I'm matured.
Well, we usually start these conversations out by asking what you would like for our listeners to get out of our interview today.
I guess I'd like them to get a sense, if they don't already have it, of the connections between trauma work, working with individual patients, and the bigger picture of how trauma and adversity impacts our workplaces and impacts our society in very similar ways to the way it impacts individuals. So that's where my interest really lies now. And I hope that I could help kind of move the dial a little bit.
Wonderful. Yeah, we're excited to hear about it. So I wondered if you could start by telling us more about the work that you're doing in the field of complex trauma.
Now I teach at the School of Public Health at Drexel University. And the reason I think I'm in the School of Public Health is because it's a little bit of an odd place for me to be. I'm a psychiatrist by training. I was an active practitioner for 30 years. But I think what happened to me was that I ran an inpatient unit for 20 of those years. And that's where we discovered for ourselves this whole issue of complex PTSD, because virtually everybody in our inpatient program really had what we now would call complex PTSD. And they taught us what that meant. And out of that, I really recognized that every problem I had been taught to treat, that people were suffering from horribly, had been at one point in time preventable. And it was infuriating, actually.
Yeah.
It made me really angry that I didn't know that, and that all of these adults, because I was treating adults, had to go through what they had to go through unnecessarily. And that led then to me looking much more deeply at how does our culture become such that it creates trauma for so many people. I've called it traumatogenic.
Oh.
and that we really have a traumatogenic culture.
Mm.
That has been denied and glossed over and ignored, or simply thought of, well, that's just human nature. That's the way it is. And I really started to doubt that that was true. So that's how I got into public health. And now I teach public health students and undergraduates. And I feel like I'm passing the baton to the next generations. And then I have a new model for organizations that's entirely online, trying to help organizations become trauma responsive. And then I'm chairing a group called the Campaign for Trauma Informed Policy and Practice. And we're a volunteer advocacy organization trying to educate members of the public, but most fundamentally aimed at members of Congress and their staff and state legislators and local legislators, to help them understand how important it is that the knowledge we've gained becomes incorporated into whatever legislation they're doing.
Wow, I'm just thinking what an important impact that is to kind of get at the roots in policy to prevent so much of what you said you felt angry about.
Yeah,
You're
exactly.
like, "This is preventable. We can work with this."
Exactly.
Wonderful, wonderful. And there was a piece where you said that working with your patients, that they really taught you what complex trauma was. I wondered if you could speak to that a little bit.
Sure. Well, now this is 1985 now.
Mhm,
So it stopped being mental health and now it's behavioral health. And we are immersed in a climate where supposedly everything is a chemical imbalance in the brain, and that's really all you need to know. And you just need to put people on medications and everything should be okay, right?
mm. The climate of the '80s.
The climate of the '80s. And because I was working with a team of people, I had a real advantage because we had this multiplicity then of learning because we were sharing each other's experiences. And we had an open, voluntary psychiatric unit in a small community hospital in a semi rural community about an hour north of Philadelphia. So it was a community that was turning from farming really into a more suburban, all white. So there was no diversity really at all. And I had worked and, from the time I was a teenager, I was a mental health tech and a secretary and had jobs in inner city. So I was much more accustomed to what happened to people who were poor and who were people of color,
Mhm,
the poverty, the drug epidemic, the violence. I'd seen that, but I hadn't learned anything about trauma in my training.
mhm,
It was there, but there was no knowledge yet really about it. So I go way out into the suburbs and learn about trauma. And it came from our patients were people who had terrible things that happened to them as children. And each one of us as team members had our own separate experiences with individual people we were working with. So some had, dissociation. Others had pretty overt PTSD. Others had substance abuse problems. And when they had stopped using, symptoms, more flagrant symptoms of PTSD had emerged. And we were pretty shocked. We just had not expected the amount of child abuse and sexual abuse that people started talking about when we were ready to listen.
mm.
And that was a key thing. I think quite often we had the history, but we hadn't paid any attention to it. Like that was something that had happened long ago. And
It's in the past.
because there was no training, there was no
Mhm,
understanding about how childhood trauma and adversity, it then progresses into becoming adult psychiatric problems. That just was not really on the screen. So we started really recognizing that around 1985, and then we started getting better histories on all of our patients. And lo and behold, it was almost universal in all of these people who had come in with all different kinds of psychiatric symptoms. We were staggered as a whole team. And then I got very lucky. I took a week-long workshop with Bessel van der Kolk and Judy Herman.
mhm, wonderful.
And to be honest, I really signed up for it because it was in Aruba.
They lured you in.
I didn't see the beach that week because the two of them had kind of synthesized what was known up to that point about trauma. And I had read Judy's book. And that was about the same time. It was about 1986, probably. And I came back from that week-long workshop with a totally changed gestalt. It was like all these things fell into place, and I had the beginning of a knowledge base around it. I made up slides, gave everybody in the practice a day off to come to a meeting where I went over in brief everything that I had learned. And then we started together, shifted as a team, started really refocusing. What does this mean? What are we supposed to do with this? We don't know what to do about this. And this was a time when we had a lot of people who cut themselves,
Yeah.
binged and purged, did a lot of self-harming behavior. And the whole thing then was very behavioral. You set up a contract, and the person had to contract that they would stop self-harming and all this
Yeah.
garbage that we were trying and that did not work. So, with things like that, we had to step back and ask our patients, what will help you? You can't heal if you're not safe. And you're not safe as long as you're doing these things. But we know you must be doing these things for a reason.
Yeah.
And they started teaching us, what just asking the questions in a different way. And we did that for about the next 6 years. We just learned a lot. And by 1991, we were in a team meeting and we had them regularly with everybody, the nursing staff, all of us, all the clinicians. And we were trying to figure out what had happened to us. And my friend Joe Fotorero, who was a social worker, said, no, it's that we've stopped asking people what's wrong with them. And now we ask what happened to them. And
Mm.
that's changed everything. And that's become a meme.
Yeah.
It was Joe that said
You
it,
said it first.
and I wrote it down. I'm glad to be able to say this because Joe just died 2 weeks ago, and
Mm.
he was so critical in doing all this work that it's good to have the opportunity to pay a tribute to him.
Yeah. What a lovely way to honor that.
Yeah, exactly. So that's what I meant by, we had to just really listen in a different way to what people were saying and change our whole focus to recognize that all things that we were calling symptoms were ways the person had learned to cope. And you can't just pull away people's coping mechanisms. You have to somehow substitute them for better coping mechanisms. And we also saw that in many ways, the things we called symptoms or problematic behaviors were really cries for help, that they were the nonverbal mind trying to signal to all of us, yo, there's something wrong here. And it would often come out the relationships with us. So that's when we learned about the drama triangle.
Mm-hmm.
So people would come, that was the advantage of having an inpatient unit, was that people would set up the story unconsciously, but they would set up their story with us, and then we could help them redesign, rescript that story and tell it in a different way. And then at the time as well, because inpatient treatment had not been destroyed, basically, we had psychodrama, we had art therapy, we had movement therapy, and those therapists all worked together to have just creative groups that were incredible.
Wow.
And we would really see in a very short period of time, we could see the beginning of transformative change. And that fueled us.
Yeah.
That made us more excited.
Yeah.
We were onto something big, 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 big
Yeah.
that people weren't talking about, that very few people seem to know anything about. And that was really exciting. And that's what drove me out into the world.
Yeah. And doing what you're doing now.
Yeah, I never anticipated in a million years what's happened.
Wow. I'm just thinking about the humility that it took for you and your whole team to sit down and say, this isn't really working. What we're doing is not working. Like that takes so much like humility and self introspection and like really creating space for there to be something different.
Absolutely.
I'm just really appreciating that. That was like the seed of what took you in this direction.
And I think what made that possible was that we were really working as a team,
Yeah, that's great.
that it was social work and nursing and the creative therapies and people who were brand new to the field. We could hear each other. We could hear each other's perspective. And it made it safe
Mm.
to be that way, to say, I don't know. I don't know what to do. And to be safe to not know, to live with uncertainty and ambiguity. It's scary if you're all by yourself.
Mm.
And we weren't all by ourselves. And being in a team made it possible.
That's wonderful. And then I'm also just hearing the creativity when you've created that safe space with each other and the willingness to not know that that's really when creativity can like ignite. Because if we think we know, then we're not going to be creative to find any solutions.
Exactly.
That's so cool. Oh, thank you for sharing that with me. So, you kind of already talked about this a little bit, but I'm curious about what really led you into working with complex trauma.
Yeah, I think it really was just happenstance. I think that once we each had these specific people. So for me, it was a young woman I had started treating when she was 18 in 1980. And her mother, who I had worked with, was a nurse because she had accused a man of rape. And the police investigated, and it hadn't happened.
Mm.
And even when you listen to her story when she first talked about it, it didn't really make sense. There was something off about it. And she was a delight. She was bright and funny and really great to work with. And so I had been doing psychotherapy for years, what I called in those days psychotherapy, psychodynamic psychotherapy. We developed a really good relationship. She trusted me. I trusted her. There would be emergency calls every now and then, usually when she was out on a date.
Mm.
But she never violated boundaries or anything. There was no really serious problems in the therapeutic relationship. She went away to finish college and go to graduate school. And I sent her to a therapist where she was in another state. I thought would be a good feminist therapist. And I get this call one day in 1985 from her mom that she's suicidal, she's using drugs. Could her mother bring her down and hospitalize her with us?
Mm.
Of course. I was puzzled. I thought she was doing great. And what is going on? And that's the day my life changed because I walked into the room once they got there to do the psychiatric evaluation, and it was her, but it wasn't her.
Mhm.
She was talking like a little girl. She was moving like a little girl. And I knew what that was, but I'd never seen it before. And I just went, oh, expletive.
Yeah.
um,
Mhm.
how is this possible? The presentation was so dramatic that I said, who are you? And she gave her name as her name. And I said, and how old are you? And she said, I'm 7.
Okay.
Okay. So that for me was a life changing scenario that occurred. And what unfolded over the course of the next couple of weeks was she had an altar, and that altar revealed to me what, in fact, had happened to her as a child. And she was an incest victim. And so her memories of the initial presentation of the rape were these confused emergence of actually dissociated memories from the past. It made sense to her mother. Her mother wasn't there and didn't witness this, but there were elements of it that I could confirm with the mother to undo my own doubt.
Mm.
You know, she went on to live a very positive life, as far as I know.
Wow.
And for Joe, it was a teenager who laid down in the middle of the road to get run over by a school bus. And she too had a dissociative identity issue. And then for Ruth Ann, who was a clinical nurse specialist, it was a woman who had a horrendous history of child abuse. And she had a lot of self harming, a lot of very complex relational problems. So those were the kinds of cases that then we got really interested in. And once we got interested in those kinds of cases, our referral network started sending us all the people they didn't know what to do with, right?
I'm sure.
So that's how we came to specialize in what we now call complex PTSD.
Mhm.
Within 2 years, maybe, we had an entire program that was just filled with people with dissociative problems and very complex PTSD problems.
And this was in that rural area that you were talking about.
Yeah, it began there in 1991. We had to move our program. We had to move it again in 1996. We had to move it again in 1999 and finally close it in 2001. So we did all this before there was any trauma-informed care.
Wow.
All of those moves were forced upon us, really.
Oh.
And that's why I became really interested in organizational stress.
And I was assuming you were expanding or something.
No, it was all the changes that were happening in mental health service delivery.
Okay.
And managed care had come in, and there was less and less room or tolerance for any kind of specialty program. We really objected to locking people up, did not want locked doors. We thought it was really important to have a voluntary unit, and that became impossible. All psychiatric units everywhere started being locked up, and we hated it. So we had to fight constantly to leave our doors open with whatever hospital we were in. Every change meant a reduction in staff, fewer and fewer people. And finally, by 2001, when they were going to insist that I fire Joe, I said, that's it. Somebody's going to die. I've got to close this program. We can do it with very few people. We've learned how to do that, but we can't do it with nobody. It's a relational system.
Yeah.
And so we closed.
Wow.
So I learned a lot about stress in organizations and dysfunctional systems as a result.
And so that really took you into the area of wanting to promote
Absolutely.
growth and change at the root level.
Absolutely. Right.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Because it was really a much larger system dysfunction that was really
Mm.
making it impossible to do good care.
Yeah. I'm curious, can I ask, since you've entered that kind of perspective or angle of working with systems, what changes have you seen happen since then? You said 2001 is when you entered?
2001 was when I closed the program. I think things have just gotten progressively worse
Okay.
since then. I think that's why we have a mental health crisis. The mental health crisis isn't about patients because it's a crisis across the board in healthcare, mental health, child welfare, you name it. All of the caregiving services are in crisis where the people delivering the care are burned out. The rates of burnout are considered to be epidemic at this point.
Right.
And that doesn't have anything to do with the individual people. It has everything to do with incredible malfunction in the systems.
Yeah.
And that's where my interest now lies.
Okay.
It starts at the top.
Mhm. I know you've written books, you've created this program that's on your website, and you're trying to influence policy. And so what are you seeing come of that? I'm curious.
I have been in this long enough to see the issues of trauma and adversity actually start to move onto center stage,
Mhm.
which I would have hoped for in 1985, but never thought I would see it happen.
Mm.
So one of the big things that occurred in 1998 when the ACEs study came out. And now we know there's no hiding it anymore in a huge body of research
Right.
that if you hurt a child, you are likely then to put the child at significant risk for every kind of mental health problem, every kind of health problem, basically,
Mhm.
and a wide array of social problems. It's just not a secret anymore. There's still lots of people that don't know, but the science it's incontrovertible. So we know where this is coming from. And in science, particularly in medical science, you have to know what is causing a problem before you can really address it.
Yeah.
So we can do something about the coronavirus and develop a vaccine and hopefully more treatment because we know what's causing the problem. We can see the virus, we can see what it does. In mental health, there hasn't been anything like that. It's been incredibly vague. If you were just learning about how to treat people, then in many places in the country, the most attention that you would get would be for being a good diagnostician, for knowing the DSM-5 and being able to put somebody in a category.
Mhm.
You may not have a clue what to do next, but you would be able to do that.
Right.
That's all about the lack of causal explanations. If you don't know where somebody who gets diagnosed with borderline personality, where it comes from, well, then how are you supposed to figure out what to do really to have that person heal? You just can't do it. So I didn't realize how important that was until I did understand cause.
Yeah.
Once we really started to put the pieces of the puzzle together, that if you did this to a kid, then the child adapts in this way. And if they adapt in A, B, and C way, they won't end up in a psychiatric unit. It might end up somewhere else, but not necessarily. If they D, E, and F adapt, those are the people that end up with us. And that is what the big deal is about all of this stuff about trauma, is that we know where it's coming from. It's coming from children not getting what they need. And where does that come from? Parents not getting what they need.
Right. Generational.
And where does that come from? Having a society that doesn't care at all
Yeah.
about really the health of the citizens. It's just all about making money.
Yeah, you've highlighted a bunch of really important things. Right now, I'm just thinking, so you're talking about the root cause. Like now we know if you do A, B, and C and they respond in this way. And so for clinicians who have felt stuck, what do you recommend?
Not only do I recommend this for clinicians, but I recommend that they do it with all their patients,
Mhm.
that they have to have a basic knowledge, a deep knowledge of what trauma and adversity does to people. There are many phases of that, but it all comes down to the same things. Even if you think you're only going to work with adults, you have to develop an expertise in understanding developmental stages and how the brain works, how, all Bruce Perry's work around the neuroscience of brain development
Mhm.
and the different approaches to use depending on where the person's brain got stuck, which is really critical.
Yeah.
And it's really hard for clinicians starting out today because so much is determined by what we'll get paid for.
Right.
When, healing is in the context of a relationship, and it's often quite hard to hold a relationship to the boundaries that are expected of us from the places where we work. So you have to learn as much as you can. And then what we did, because we went through that kind of grinding down experience. And in that process, we learned to focus on 4 domains:
Hmm.
safety, emotions, loss, and future. And we call it self, and we used it as a compass so that it wasn't stages. It wasn't stages of recovery. It was more you used it at every stage, but you move it around depending on where the person's at in the moment. So
I love that.
you can't really make any movement in recovery unless you feel safe, unless you are
Yeah.
safe in the world, safe with yourself, safe with other people. Once you just start doing that, though, it's going to bring up emotions, because whatever you have to stop doing, you're going to feel bad when you stop doing it.
Yeah.
You have to then focus on emotional management. How am I going to manage that bad feeling that I have? Which leads directly to the L. What am I going to have to give up in order to manage the feeling successfully so I don't go back and do the unsafe behavior? I'm going to have to give up something. And giving up something is really hard for me to do because I've already had a lot of losses. So the F is about, why should I do that? What is the future I want to get to that makes it worth going through that pain in order to get to that future? Well, I'm going to have to get safer than I am. And that's how it keeps going in a circle.
Mhm.
As we had less and less time with more and more complex people and fewer of us, self became a really useful tool. And we developed our whole psychoeducational program around self. So we would teach the same thing to all of our patients so that they would be able to use that for their own problem solving, because we would only be with them for a brief period of time.
Mhm.
Outpatient therapy, you only see your therapist maybe once a week. So there had to be some tools that they used in between. And so I think that psychoeducation is the beginning of any kind of treatment with complex problems. It is about beginning to have them make that same shift from what's wrong with me? The hell is wrong with me?
Mhm.
I can understand what happened to me. then I can start empowering myself to do something else.
I so appreciate that because just in that question, in NARM, we talk a lot about shame and like how we can shame ourselves, especially if we've been asked that question, then we just keep asking ourselves that question, like, what's wrong with me?
Exactly.
Which is totally pathologizing ourselves.
Right.
And so just that very simple reframe, it's such a beautiful step to just take a step in a direction of like, I'm not going to shame myself around this. I'm going to ask myself what happened to me and why am I showing up now in the present in this way because of, what happened.
Exactly. And I mean, it helps people to see that even the really problematic stuff they do, so like substance abuse, right? People who are addicted, if they understand what happened to them, then there's a point they can point to in time where it was the only way they had to cope
Right.
was to take that drink or do that drug. And that alleviated the pain, at least for a little while. But then it became habitual because we, as a species, we develop habits really quickly. So
Mhm.
you can still see even the most problematic behaviors as the way the person adapted to adverse conditions. People can stop feeling shame and start feeling more empowered. Well, I don't have to go on doing that.
Mm.
You don't. It worked then, and it probably was better than a lot of things you could have done, but now it's not really serving you very well.
Which is a lot easier to kind of take that risk, can feel really risky for so many.
Yeah,
It's so much better and easier to take that risk of changing it up when we're not shaming ourselves.
exactly. That does no good at all. All that trash talk just keeps us in a rut. And we keep blaming ourselves when really there were external things that happened that caused this stuff in the first place.
Yeah, and I just think of how much energy is often wasted in that self-shaming where we can put that energy toward the
Absolutely.
growth and moving through it. So, I really appreciate you sharing that. How you kinda came to that point of where you're at now and developing courses and writing books and doing the work that you're doing. I really, really appreciate it. Just as we kind of move toward wrapping up, I wondered if you could share with us any other stories. I mean, you did share that one story of the client, but I wondered if there was any other stories you felt were inspiring or that you think might be helpful in illustrating what you're talking about.
I think it's important for people that work in organizations to recognize that these are also living beings. They are complex, adaptive living systems, and therefore they can be traumatized, they're chronically stressed as whole organizations, and they have memory. So I worked with an organization, it was a child welfare organization, and about 30, 40 years before, they had had a tragedy on their campus. One child, I believe it was that one child had killed another child. Awful, terribly traumatic thing for everyone that worked in the organization. And I was meeting with the leadership team in the present. And the key members of the leadership team had all been there when this tragedy occurred. And in talking about self, particularly loss, they realized that they had never processed any of it.
Oh, wow.
And what they also realized was that that event of 30 years before was continuing to determine the policies and procedures that they were using in the present. That's exactly what happens
Wow.
in individuals' lives.
Yeah.
Also, what happens in the life of organizations is that loss does not get processed in organizations in any better way than it does in the lives of individuals.
Wow.
And it continues to haunt whole organizations, just like loss haunts us.
Wow. That is part of the work that you're doing is you're coming into organizations and helping them process some of this grief and trauma that they've experienced.
Yes, exactly.
Wow. I appreciate you teaching us that, even understanding that you said something that jumped out at me. Organizations have a memory. Just knowing that and understanding that, I'm sure will help folks.
Absolutely. We invest parts of ourselves into places where we work. We're a group species.
Right.
And when we join an organization, it becomes part of our individual identity. So that if the organization gets hurt, we all feel it, even if we had nothing to do with the incidents that occurred. They're living, complex, adaptive systems, and we're a part of it, just like our cells are part of us.
Mhm.
We call it parallel process, and it's a biological metaphor, getting away from the machine metaphor that really has dominated our existence for hundreds of years. Bye bye ideas of machines, and enter the idea of complex adaptive living systems at every level.
I mean, it makes so much sense because I wouldn't have been surprised by the idea of like a family system remembering.
Right.
I mean, it's the same thing, right? A family's going to remember, through generations. People can, even if they weren't there, even if they weren't alive at the time, they can feel it in their bodies. That makes so much sense. So I just hadn't put my brain in that place of thinking,
It's just going up a level, and you just keep going up levels of organization, and the memory is always there. Yeah.
wow. Well, that's exciting work. I appreciate that there's folks like you out there that are doing that work and how that's affecting our world.
Thanks.
That's really important. I wondered if there was anything else that you'd like to share with us before we wrap up our conversation today.
No, Emily, it's really nice being with you. It's lovely just to be able to have a conversation.
And I love it. I feel so lucky that I get to have these conversations. It really is my favorite part of my week. Where can folks find the work that you're doing? I mean, I know I've looked at your book and seen where those are at, but could you share with listeners?
Yeah, my website where all my articles are is sandrabloom.com. And that's also the self-curriculum. The psychoed curriculum is for sale there.
Great.
And then Presence is my new organizational approach. It's all online. And you can find information about that at creatingpresence.net.
Okay. Great. We'll put those in the show notes. And then I imagine we'll probably link to your books too, if those or are those on your website?
Yeah, that'd be great. Yeah, that'd be terrific.
Awesome.
They're all on Amazon.
Okay.
You can download those.
Okay, great. Ebooks. Well, thank you again, Sandy. I really appreciate this
Thank you.
conversation and appreciate your just showing up and in the world and doing the work that you're doing.
Thanks, Emily. It's been a great pleasure. Passing the baton.
Passing the baton. Thank you. Thanks so much for joining us for today's episode. To find more about our guest and their work, check the show notes or visit us at narmtraining.com/transformingtrauma. The practical guide for healing developmental trauma is available for pre-order now on Amazon and other online book retailers. Please visit narmtraining.com/books to stay up to date on the latest news, promotions, and giveaways. Thanks to Andrea Klunder and the Creative Imposter Studios for producing and editing, to Tori Essex for our album art, and to Brad Kammer for the creation of this podcast. We look forward to building community, connection with you, and changing the world by transforming trauma.